Today I thought I'd spend a couple minutes talking about choose your own adventure style interactive fiction, fighting fantasy game books, Fabled Lands, and some of the newer interactive fiction that's coming out these days. And then thought I would take a couple minutes to explain my process, how I'm writing my own interactive fiction. When I was in elementary school, I started reading the Choose Your Own Adventure series, and they were very simple books with very simple branching narratives designed for, fifth graders or whatever. And I always struggled with reading when I was a kid. I think I had dyslexia or something along those lines, was never diagnosed, but really struggled with reading and reading comprehension and did everything I could to avoid reading. And those Choose Your Own Adventure books were really the first books that got me interested and excited about reading. And then when I was a preteen, maybe 10 to 12 years old, I started getting into the fighting fantasy books. These fighting fantasy game books really took the whole genre to the next level. They have a system for generating characters and keeping track of different stats like skill and luck. There was an inventory, and you could find items on your adventure and add them to your inventory. There was dice-based combat. So there was a lot going on in these books. These books felt a lot less like interactive fiction and more like an actual game. Warlock of Firetop Mountain, Citadel of Chaos, Forest of Doom, Starship Traveler, City of Thieves, Death Trap Dungeon, Island of the Lizard King, and it went on. I think they did like 50 or 60 of these books, maybe more. And I lost mine along the way, but ended up repurchasing the first 7 at some point. And I took a spin through them not too long ago, and I wanted to just see how they held up. And I had a blast playing them as an adult. I never got all the way through Warlock of Firetop Mountain as a kid. I got pretty far, but I would always get stuck in the maze. So when I played through it again as an adult not too long ago, I made maps and I kept track of everything and tried to completely map the entire book, and had a blast with it. I also did Forest of Doom. This is the entire map for Forest of Doom, and then I ended up doing like a nicer Photoshop map of the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. So this is the complete book of Warlock of Firetop Mountain with the solution mapped in yellow, and then all the relevant section numbers listed on the map. So this is a lot of fun. It's amazing that just a book with paragraphs and a simple rule set can lend itself to this type of adventuring and exploring and mapping. Within the last year or two, when I was sort of diving back into Choose Your Own Adventure books and thinking about them as a viable mode of creative expression, I started researching, trying to figure out what I missed as a kid and what I've missed between then and now. And I did a lot of research, came up with Fabled Lands, ended up purchasing the first couple books. And there are 7 books in the series. And after I played through the first couple books, I fell in love with the series. I ended up buying all 7. And this really takes the fighting fantasy style gameplay to like a whole new level. The thing about fighting fantasy is you're slowly working your way through the dungeon, and you don't backtrack. Like every choice you make is sort of a one-way door you go through, and you never go back the way you came. There might be a couple places where you can sort of go back to the junction and go the other way, but for the most part, you're always moving forward. You're always moving from the beginning of the dungeon to the end. And with Fabled Lands, this is an entirely open world. You can head west across the realm and then decide to turn around and go back east. And there are different quests to get unlocked along the way. And there's this huge world map. And then each book is a certain region within the map. So for instance, book 1 is this area, which is represented right here, this little area on the map. And so the 7 books basically define the 7 regions on this huge world map, and you can trek all the way across from book 1 to book 7 and back to book 4 and back to book 1, and you can unlock quests and missions along the way. And how it all works is that you have these code words. So, once you unlock a code word, you add it to your adventure sheet. And then if you're in another region, it'll be like, hey, do you have this code word? And if you do, then it knows that you're sort of on this path or on this quest. And you can have more than one code word at once. So, at some point you may have like a dozen different code words, and they're all just various toggle switches for various quests. And some of the quests are pretty involved. Like there was one where, I went to the king of this realm, and he's like, yeah, there are some people trying to overthrow me in the mountains to the north. Like, will you go basically take care of them and squash the coup? And so I accepted the quest. I traveled to the mountains to try to find these rebels and purge them. And when I got there, I had the option of actually flipping to their side if I wanted. And so then I became a double agent. So I went back to the king to pretend to tell him that, like, yeah, I took care of the rebels, but actually I went back to kill the king. And it's crazy how involved some of the stuff in these books gets. I just really, really love Fabled Lands. And this is really the closest thing I think I've ever played to a solitaire role-playing game. I know there's different ways that you can play role-playing games solitaire using like an oracle, like the mythic emulator and all that. But really, at the end of the day, if you're playing a role-playing game solitaire, what you really want is a dungeon master that's not you, some sort of automated, simulated dungeon master that's guiding you along the way and feeding you a story. And this is it. Like, these 7 books represent a dungeon master and a world. And I spent hours and hours and only got through the first couple regions. And at some point I hopped on a boat and I was able to sail, I think, all the way to region 7, this is a newer book that came out years after the first 6. And this was the only one that was not written by the original 2 authors. And I don't know, I can't say enough good things about it. It took me a little bit to get into it. Once I really got into it, I was hooked. Some of the very recent Choose Your Own Adventure style books that I've come across, Rider of the Black Sun was a Kickstarter that I backed. And I liked it just because it was a fantasy adventure, but it was this epic tome with like over 1,000 sections. And I was sort of enamored by just the size and the scope of this book. I definitely think I prefer Fabled Lands over Rider of the Black Sun, but I do love the idea of like an epic tome that is a choose your own adventure book. And their rule system is pretty good. There's a nice map, and the character sheet is pretty involved. And then another book that I picked up recently was Retune. This was written by Runehammer. Brandish Gilhelm, he's great. He's a kind of a one-man show. He builds games and does a lot of podcasts or video blogs on game mastering, dungeon mastering. This book really goes back to the roots of being just interactive fiction. There's no character sheet. There's no rule set. It's really just these chapters that are 1 to 4 pages long, and then at the end of each section, at the end of each chapter, you've got a couple choices you can make. So this feels a lot more like fiction and a lot less like a game book. He calls it the Folded Path book. That's kind of his little moniker for his interactive fiction. So for my book, I've decided that I don't necessarily want to do just interactive fiction. So I'm not going to be doing the choose your own adventure approach or the retune approach. I want to do something that's more like a game book, and I want it to be open world like Fabled Lands, but I also want it to be a little smaller in scope and scale, something a little more of the lines like the fighting fantasy game books, because this is my first attempt to write a book, period. So I want to start small. I don't want to try to create like a big, like 7-book open world. I like the idea of going with something like Warlock of Firetop Mountain, but what if you could go into the dungeon and then come all the way back out? What if you could take path A and then go back and take path B? And what What if you weren't sort of slowly one-way gated from the beginning to the end? And so I think that's my goal, is to sort of find a sweet middle spot between the epic open world of Fabled Lands and the nice, tighter, more efficient approach of the fighting fantasy game books. So then the question is, how do I go about writing a choose your own adventure fighting fantasy style game book? And the answer is, I really had no idea. So I just had to come up with my own system. The first thing I did was just took a look at the books that I'm trying to emulate, and I measured them. I figured out what the font size was, what the margins were like, and how many pages they were, how many sections they were. And so I decided for my book, I was going to do 400 sections, and I was going to do a choke point at every 100 sections. So the first 100 sections take place on Earth. And as you can see, this section is completely done. All these blue cells on my little Google spreadsheet, I just have one cell for each section with the section number. And you can see here, I'm almost done with this section. All the blue cells here are sections that I've written. And then I started including the actual choice section numbers here too. So now I can just at a glance look and be like, oh, drift to Palmer, that means something to me, obviously. And then it wants me to go to section 183. So there's no choice there. You just jump to 183. So you go to 183 and you have to fight the pirates. And then, there's a successful outcome and an unsuccessful outcome. And then, so like, let's say you beat them, 157, here you defeated the pirates. And then, you would go to section 102 or 112. 102, investigate the docking hub. So really, I can sort of take a look at the entire flow of the book just using these spreadsheets. And I can even use these spreadsheets to QA the book after the book is written. So I've got, as you can see, these white ones are paragraphs that haven't been used at all. And these green ones are paragraphs that I have another paragraph linking to, like the bar cantina. Some of these other paragraphs will link to the bar, to the cantina. But I haven't written this chapter yet, or this section yet. So I know that section 144 is the bar. So now I just, at some point, will need to go write that. And then once I assign out points for that section, then I will change the color of that to blue. And then when all the sections are blue, or red or yellow, then I'm done with this whole thing. So that's kind of how this whole book is structured. We start on Earth, then we go to low Earth orbit, and then we go to the moon, and then we go to Mars as we chase the evil genius and get in lots of fights with space pirates and bots. One thing I did after I finished the first 100 sections was I made a flowchart. This took a long time, and it was really tedious to do, and I've decided not to use these flowcharts for future books or future sections of this book. There's just way too much overhead to do this. And then the last thing I do is I draw lots of maps because I think mapping game books is one of my favorite things to do when I'm playing a game book. I wanted my game books to be mappable. So this was the very first map I did for the first 100 sections. You start in your hover car, and then you try to infiltrate this compound. And this map turned into a real mess. And then I tried to streamline it a little bit. And I tried to make maps of the different levels of the compound, and I kind of went about it different ways because I was just trying to get an idea of what the best way to represent all this space on a map is. And then once I finally really got my brain around it, this is the final Photoshop version of the map of the compound. And so you've got level 1, level 2, level 3, and then the sub-level. And I may or may not even include these in the final book. I think it'd be kind of cool to have maps in the final book, but maybe they're not labeled, and then you can label them as you explore them. So I'm kind of toying with that. And then for the second 100 sections, like I said, they're in low Earth orbit, and they spend most of their time on this orbital station called Palmer Taurus, which is kind of based off the old Stanford Taurus space station design, where they spin to simulate gravity. And so this was my attempt to go with a nonlinear approach, kind of an open sandbox approach to this level. And what happens is once you get to the Palmer Taurus, you can actually explore it. You can walk through all these paragraphs, and then you can turn around and walk the other way. You can go up to the central hub, go to the docking ports, come back down, go down a hub into like some other section, and then each quadrant has like different areas to explore. Like there's an agricultural area over here, like a farm, and then there's a factory zone, and then there's the bar is over here, and then over here you have like low rent apartments. There's all these like windy, twisty passages with sketchy locals, and this is a troubled outpost with lots of black market activity going on. And then here you have a market with different vendors that you can interact with and try to gain information from and buy ultra focus pills from. So this is working out better than I thought. Making these levels kind of like open sandbox worlds to explore is super, super fun. It gets kind of tricky, and that's where the code words come in, because I can toggle the values of codes, which can send you to different paragraphs based on like maybe where you've been and where you need to go, stuff like that. But ultimately, you can go anywhere you want on this level, and until you find the clues that you need to get out of it. You know, the first 100 sections are done. This is infiltrating the Evil Genius's compound. So this is where I was with the second 100 sections, the Palmer Taurus, before this week, and then here's where I am now. So I've written a lot of sections this week and kind of moved the ball forward with that. And then after that, I'll probably finish this today or tomorrow. And then after that, I've got 200 more sections to write, which is nothing to laugh at. I mean, it's going to take me probably a month total to write 200 sections. But yeah, I'm basically halfway done with the book at this point.